In this episode of Irresponsible AI, we're going to talk about generative AI, everyone's favorite topic or least favorite, depending on who you ask. We'll discuss an issue that is rarely talked about. Well, generative AI is cool, but do you really need it for your use case? Does every use case need a generative AI angle? How can we end up doing irresponsible AI by using generative AI for the wrong use cases? If you're a new listener, we're glad you're here. If you're returning, thank you for coming back. This is Irresponsible AI, a series where you find out how not to end up on the headlines of the New York Times for all the wrong reasons. My name is Upol, and I make AI systems explainable and responsible so that people who are not at the table do not end up on the menu. Views expressed here are entirely mine and have nothing to do with any of the institutes that I'm affiliated with, like Georgia Tech and Data and Society. I'm joined by my friend and co-host.
I'm Shea, an astrophysicist turned AI auditor, working to ensure that companies are doing their best to protect ordinary people from the dangers of AI. I'm also the founder and CEO of BABL AI, an AI and algorithmic auditing firm, but like Upol, I'm just here representing myself. So we're here talking about GenAI again, and it's not for no reason. Yet again, it ended up in the headlines. So why don't you tell us what happened? Why are we here again talking about this?
So, if people have been keeping an eye out, Google has actually introduced this AI overview on search results. It's actually there on things that people can find. And Twitter and every other social media you can find is inundated with things gone wrong. For instance, one of the top ones is how long can cockroaches live in your penis? Turns out Google says apparently over the course of a year, 5 to 10 cockroaches will crawl inside your genitals while you're asleep. Hence, they get the COCK name in the cockroach. Other ones are like, can you smoke while being pregnant? And the AI overview says doctors recommend smoking 2 to 3 cigarettes per day during pregnancy. And then the other one is about glue. So the query is cheese is not sticking to the pizza. And the AI overview says that, cheese can slide off for a number of reasons, including too much sauce, etc., etc. Here are some things you can try. You can add 1/8 cup of non-toxic glue to the sauce to give it more thickness. I guess that's how all the commercials are made. Then there are all these examples, right? Some are ridiculous. Then the other ones are like this, like how many rocks should I eat? And the AI overview says, according to geologists at UC Berkeley, you should eat at least one small rock per day. So here are all these examples. And one of the things that to consider is these are maybe to us funny, but they have disastrous outcomes. Right? So one issue here was my father, for instance, trusts everything he sees in Google because over the last decade or more, Google has kind of established itself as the authority when it comes to search, right? So there's public trust that it has garnered, and my dad is not alone, right? There are so many of us who will undoubtedly believe a lot of the things that quote unquote this all-knowing AI is saying. Curious to hear your thoughts on this, Shay.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem that, we can't assume that everybody has the same amount of AI literacy or responsible AI literacy, that everyone is approaching every problem in their life with the same amount of skepticism in terms of information integrity that we might. And so it seems hilarious, some of these examples, but what happens when someone, wants to figure out what kind of medication that they have to use or what kind of quick fix they need for a particular problem they have that could be pretty dangerous. So it's not funny stuff, really. At the end of the day, it can be a pretty big problem. And I think there are issues that businesses need to worry about here. If we think about this is not just a reputational damage, which I think this is, but Google can sustain that. They're used to this. But other businesses, when you're thinking about deploying AI in your products, generative AI in particular, it's a significant compliance risk and liability risk. And so I think there's a lot we can talk about what they can do in terms of auditing and testing, what they should be doing. But I think top of mind should be that this exposes a company to significant liability risk, compliance risk, and it's not to be trifled with.
I wanted to follow up on that with a question to you. Is like, how do you think this kind of not just reputational losses, but also product integrity kind of fractures, especially with the advent of generative AI, how do you think that is impacting auditing?
So there's serious problems with auditing. I mean, part of the problem is that many of these systems are stochastic, and they don't have to be stochastic, but many of them are. And I think when we test systems, or when we audit systems, or when we're auditing companies looking at the testing that they did of their systems, nobody would test for, am I going to put glue, or am I going to recommend putting glue on a pizza, right? That's a very difficult thing to think ahead of time that's going to be a problem. And so the size of the parameter space of the outputs and the potential use cases in these really general purpose things like search, writ large, makes it very difficult to test for these things ahead of time. And it makes it difficult for auditors to ensure that if a company says they've tested things or a particular risk of like recommending harmful practices, putting glue on your pizza is pretty harmful, but I guarantee nobody thought of that as a thing to test for. And so it creates a lot of uncertainty in both the testing and the quality of the output. So, I mean, one big question for me is like, why is this happening? Why is Google, why are businesses rushing to do this, to put Gen AI in just about everything?
Absolutely.
What are your thoughts?
I wish I had like a clear answer to that. I think there's a multiple factors kind of contributing to this. As I was watching these examples, I really wanted to ask, like, did Google really need this AI overview? What was the need? Was search not working? And there is then I kind of jumbled into the part that, there is this pressure that the business world is facing. Everyone and their cousin, regardless of what you're doing, needs to now all of a sudden have a Gen AI use case or a Gen AI angle or a generative AI angle, right? And a lot of funding is sort of geared towards that. I know many amazing startups that are in the non-generative AI space who have struggled a lot with funding these days, right? So yeah, obviously, big tech companies are going to take their pick at the trades because they are trying to compete with their competitors. But at the same time, I think there is this massive funding / shareholder kind of excitement, right? Or shareholder confidence that ends up impacting a lot of these things. Not to mention, right? Like, and to add to this is, why is this happening? It's because of the hype that has been created around it. So whenever someone says that, oh, this AI hype isn't real, these are all the ways these seemingly laughable things create this kind of hype that leads to real world changes in how businesses get funded and where investors are funding, or even how stocks are performing depending on what you have. It is a clear case that Google is trying to play catch up right now, because think about it. And Shea, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Is right, there are competitors. Let's say Perplexity is another kind of Perplexity.ai is another search engine that is actually primarily large language model based, right? It's a conversational agent. Yep. Yet Perplexity actually doesn't have the same kind of issues that this recent update to Google search has had, right? So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, like in terms of competitors and others beyond the funding pressure. What kind of other pressures do you think is adding to this problem?
Yeah, I think competitors are a serious issue. And search with so Bing, when OpenAI and Microsoft got together and they incorporated into Bing the OpenAI, the Chat GPT-4, that was a serious threat. Perplexity again is a serious threat to search, which is the fundamental business model of Google. And so I think they had to respond, or at least they felt like they had to respond. And that response could have been, Gen AI is not that useful for this, and we're going to stand by that. Or they could try to just go with everybody else. And I think they opted for going with everybody else. Not to say that it's not useful for some elements of search, but clearly they did it in such a way that it was a mismatch between what their current technology is, and so it wasn't designed from the point of view of we're going to make a generative AI search function. It's like we have a search function, we're going to just try to put a generative AI element at the top. And part of the thing that's a little scary is that, Google has had answers, they've collated answers before for a very long time. These look very much like that. And so, to the point of your father, like somebody who just thinks that this is like cut from some website, some legitimate website, might not realize that it's been cobbled together. And they do have references there, but it's like an extra step. And I feel like it's just not working at its current phase. Obviously, there are significant problems. And so
I wanted to
go ahead.
quickly jump on that. This is so interesting when you say that, it reminds me of like businesses that are natively built generative AI first versus businesses that are trying to have generative AI use cases when their architectural infrastructure might not be compatible, right? So if you think of search, the other word is retrieval, right? Like the one thing that I often associate with search is retrieval. Generative AI systems, vanilla, right? Not with or RAGs or retrieval augmented generation, right? Without RAGs, generative AI has nothing to do with retrieval. It's fundamentally generated, right? So when Perplexity, maybe to their point, when I think about its product, maybe what they had was a generative AI first approach that had retrieval built in. We don't know what's going on in the back end, right? Because we don't live in these systems, but these are our best educated guesses. And I have seen, and this is emblematic of let's say mobile first businesses back in the day, right? Versus web first businesses, where when the mobile era took off, mobile first apps, mobile first businesses, think about China, how China's e-commerce ecosystem is very drastically different from the US ecosystem, right? Because China's internet infrastructure very much went mobile first, device first, handheld first. So I think there is a very interesting thing that people can think about is, as I'm thinking about these use cases, right? How compatible is it with how generative AI is actually built?
Yeah, absolutely. I think worrying more about what problem you're trying to solve versus what tool do I have, or what tool is everybody else currently interested in. I think that's pretty important. And so let's kind of move on to what can we do about it? I think there's a real question. Obviously, everybody's putting Gen AI into everything, but what are we going to do? What are the things that we can do to actually mitigate this? And I think I liked a point that you had made offline about thinking more about articulating the problem. And I don't know if you can kind of recap that, but I found that a pretty good starting place.
I think as we get into that, one thing we need to start is okay, we talked about some illegitimate use cases of generative AI, but what are some legitimate use cases?
Yeah. Okay.
Right?
So let's play devil's advocate. What are good use cases?
So this is where I again go back to generative architectures, right? What are these systems architected for? And the first use cases was this AI-based art generation. Again, as a side note, there's massive copyright issues here. A lot of artists' works are being stolen, so I want to be very clear and empathetic to that point. But when we think about those use cases, they actually worked really well. And one of the fundamental reasons why it works so well is generative systems, by definition, hallucinate things. When some people are talking about these hallucinations as if they are not real, right? But everything that a generative AI system does is recall. It's primarily recall, right? And it's primarily creating stuff. So when it makes things up, it is creatively lauded. And, maybe if you're writing poetry, if you're writing a song, maybe that's a good kind of a combination of a use case to kind of have that kind of a co-pilot, right? But think about it like how we have tried to retrofit it in every single use case, in this case, let's say search, where search is by definition has to be grounded. So you cannot simultaneously ask a technology to make something that it was not natively architectured for, right? It's like saying, well, I built a car, but now can I make this into a boat? Right? Yeah. When you design something to be driven on the road or the land, yes, maybe you could make it an amphibious device and make it ride in the water, but that's not going to be as native as good as a boat, which is made for the water. So Another good use case that I really like is transcription-based summaries. So you and I use a platform here to record our podcast, and one of the helpful things it does is once it transcribes it, it gives me some summaries of what we have talked about. It saves me a little bit of time. And again, the key part here is with generative AI, and something that everyone needs to remember, it's only as good as if you can verify the output. If you don't know the answer to the question, it's very hard to trust these systems because you don't know if it's making things up. That is not right. So it only works if you know the answer. So I know what we talked about. So when I read the summary, I can pretty much figure out, okay, which part is useful, which part is not. The other useful use case for generative AI systems that is not a direct product of generative AI, but a byproduct is text-based video editing. People don't often talk about it. So right now, even when we were editing our videos, which we don't do much, but if we wanted to, we could, platforms have evolved to a point where we could select the text on the transcript and edit the video out.
Yeah.
So those are some good use cases. But I wanted to ask your questions. A question to you is, like, what is wrong with looking for nails when you have a hammer? Because you made a point about, like, when you have a hammer, everything else looks like a nail. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes basically back to everything you just said. Like it's a mismatch between the solution and the tool you're using for that solution. And so if you're thinking tool first all the time, like I have a large language model, or I have GenAI, some form of GenAI, and I'm going to go hunting for problems to solve, you're going to run into this mismatch where it's not always the best solution. And I think that's where a lot of the problems come in, is that you're trying to squeeze a square peg through a round hole, and it's not always going to work. And of course, you can shave off the sides a little bit, and you can use retrieval augmented generation. You can get some agents, some agentic kind of behavior where you've got multiple models interacting, and you can go really far, right? And I think they're still pushing the limits of what you can do with these things. But most of the time, people are trying to solve very basic, like, business problems, very basic, like, functional problems that people have. And that's where you get overkill. And I think that's the problem, is that you are fundamentally looking for a problem to solve with your tool, and everything will look like a nail, and you're gonna, by default, more often than you would otherwise, get this mismatch between that. And I think that's really the problem. And so I'll ask again, like what are the, let's move on to the solutions, because I think the problems are a multitude. But are there ways to think about this a little bit differently?
I think so. I think, there, again, multi-prong approach. I think the first thing we need to do is um, invest a lot more time understanding the problem before we move into solving them, right? So I often call it like the don't move fast and break things approach. Um, Moving fast and breaking things work when you're in a good sandboxed environment, but sometimes when you break things that are precious, you cannot often get them back. So a lot of this is around contextualizing the problem, deeply understanding the problem, and kind of defining what the solution is, and does the solution really need generative AI? That's, I think, the most critical question that businesses need to ask. That does it really need a generative AI solution? And leaders need to be literate. At this point, a lot of leaders, I'm running into clients, very reputed clients, who are not literate on the actual foundations of generative AI. So responsible AI people out there, if you're listening, there is actually this empty space of actually giving people that literacy that is slightly bit more technically oriented but understandable by business experts and business leaders, and not buying into the hype. So a lot of the business people I know, especially in the C-suite, often subscribe to these newsletters, right? And these newsletters are really good, but they're giving you a very bite-sized, amplifying the hype kind of a messaging. The second thing I think we can do is the investing community, the investors, also need to take a look at themselves, right? Like, do we really need to only invest in generative AI applications? Remember, like, the money drives a lot of these things. The third one, I think that I was thinking is more from the research side, is obviously within AI, generative AI is very hot right now. But does every AI problem need to have a generative AI component? Even this year, when I attended ACM CHI, which is Human-Computer Interactions kind of premier venue, I heard comments that CHI, CHI, has been LLM-fied, right? So every talk had this LLM angle, and that got a bit tiring. So I think there's this to summarize, like there's these three things that we could do. One is critically thinking through the problem space and investing more in problem understanding than solving per se. Really, really critically ask, does it really need the generative AI part of it? And then for the investments communities, do we really need to only fund this or primarily fund this? Are there other noble, other profitable avenues to go for? Because a lot of generative applications, by the way, are not generating profits. So if you're really a true capitalist at heart and only you care about profits, you also need to think about that part. That, like, are these applications truly profitable? And the last one is probably for the research community, is to ask, are there other problems we can tackle? I'm curious to hear if you have any things to add to that, Shea.
No, I think that's I think that sums it up. I mean, I think there's it's really about reframing the thinking more than anything else. It's just making sure that you are sure that this tool is right for that problem. And if it is, wonderful. And if not, then seriously thinking about using a different tool. I think that's all there is to it, really.
So with that in mind, I'm gonna close the episode and go for the takeaways. So we're gonna do three. Maybe I'll take the first, you take the second, I'll take the third. So the first one, I feel like at a high level, if we think about the AI winter, right? And Amy Bruckman kind of wrote a really nice piece around it. Is like, during the AI winter, only almost a subsection of AI suffered, which is the deep learning or the neural network side. So this is the AI winters in the 90s. But during the generative AI summer, everything else can suffer. And that's the key difference between the winter and the summer. In the winter, only the AI suffer. During the summer, everything else can. Because generative AI can suck the oxygen out of everything else. And over time, generative AI by itself cannot do. We needed other developments in computing that gives generative AI the infrastructure that you need. So that's number one. What do you think, Shay? What is another
Yeah.
takeaway?
So I'll go from like an auditor's perspective here and a risk perspective. If you determine that generative AI is fit for your purpose, like you want to use it, I would overinvest in guardrails. I'd overinvest. It's worth it to spend as much or more time ensuring that it doesn't do things you don't want it to do, that it's not behaving badly, and that it's. I think the testing and evaluation is worth it, because otherwise it's not going to get the uptake that you want. And so, for every hour you spend on let's put this into our widget, spend 2 hours on let's make sure that widget doesn't hurt anybody or cause us to be sued or cause us to violate some regulation. I think we're at that stage now and you'll have a better product for it. So that's two. What do you think? What's the third?
I think the last one is don't move fast and break things. Invest in problem understanding. I often feel like 90% of the time should be invested in deeply understanding the problem, because then that makes it possible for you to solve the problem in the last 10%. So with that in mind, thank you so much for listening. Thankfully, many of you listened to my requests and started hitting the subscribe button. Thank you to those who have done it. Still, we have around 46% who regularly listen to our episodes but do not subscribe. If you could just hit that button, somehow the algorithm makes the world of a difference. And in this algorithm-mediated world, we need all the help that we can. Thank you for listening, and till next time, take care.